Good afternoon. My name is Allison Kaplan. I'm Director of Education at the National First Ladies Library. I want to welcome you to today's Legacy Lecture, and I want to mention some upcoming activities here at the National First Ladies Library, located at the National First Ladies Library Historic Site in Canton, Ohio. We are deep into wedding season here at the National First Ladies Library and probably throughout the world, given the summer and the nice temperatures that are approaching. So we have a number of wedding related programs coming up in the next few months that we want to invite you to. We will get to today's program and its significant anniversary, but we have an additional anniversary coming up this Friday. So we are transitioning to a few in-person programs, and this Friday, we will be celebrating the McKinley's 150th wedding anniversary with Christ Presbyterian Church here in Canton. And we want to invite you, if you are local or in the area, to a wedding reenactment as part of Canton's First Friday that will take place at Christ Presbyterian Church, the actual site of the McKinley's wedding ceremony. And we are doing 3 reenactments throughout the evening, as well as stops along several McKinley related historic sites here in Canton, Ohio. So it should be a really wonderful event. We're extremely excited about it, and we're excited to finally interact in person with some people. So please stop by and help us celebrate. July 7th, our next legacy lecture will feature our own Michelle Gullion, who will be speaking on the life and times of fashion designer Anne Lowe. We have 3 different exhibitions that have just opened at our education center, one of which features Anne Lowe and her history. Anne Lowe, if you are not familiar with her, is the couture designer who is best known for designing Jacqueline Kennedy's wedding dress. It is really gorgeous. She has an amazing and interesting history, all that she was able to overcome as an African American woman during the Jim Crow era and become an exquisite couture designer. So we're extremely excited about that talk. And if you get a chance to come to Canton to see some of the amazing perfume gowns in our collection that are designed by Anne Lowe, and you'll get a chance to kind of analyze different dresses and figure out if they're Anne Lowe dresses or not and compare them. So we're really excited to have Michelle speak on that. We also have a film series going on here with our partners at Stark Library. We will be sending a link out to our out-of-state friends who have registered for Equal Means Equal. There is still time to access that, either through the Stark Library, your local library, or however you want to plug in. We are going to be discussing Equal Means Equal, a documentary about the Equal Rights Amendment with Tracy Thomas of the University of Akron's Law School. And last but not least, we have a really great curator series coming up. Michelle is doing double duty. She's going to be talking about artifacts from the 1967 wedding of Linda Bird Johnson at the White House. So that should be really fun too. We're going to look at a number of objects in the National First Ladies Library collection. And last but not least, I wanted to mention our book club. We are going to be reading Eleanor by David McCullough, the brand new biography on Eleanor, on August 23rd. So if you're looking for a really fun beach read, I think it should be a good one. We just read White Houses, so we'll be comparing fact and fiction related to Eleanor. And without further ado, I want to introduce you to our speaker today. And I want to encourage you, it looks like people are already using the chat to share information. If you have questions, please offer questions, AV issues you're having, anything that you want to share related to First Ladies, or you want to share where you're coming from today, please do so in the chat and we will get to those questions at the end of the talk. It looks like we're already doing some troubleshooting for audio, so if you can hear me, give me a thumbs up. But without further ado, I want to tell you about today's speaker so I can turn things over to her. We are very excited to have Annette Dunlap here today. Annette Dunlap has been a North Carolina-based freelance writer for over 30 years. She has written for a variety of publications, including op-eds for the Fayetteville Observer, the Charlotte Observer, and the Pilot in Moore County. She was a freelance reporter for the Asheboro Courier Tribune and has been a contributor to inspirational magazines, business publications, and White House history. Annette is the author of 3 nonfiction books: Frank, the story of Frances Folsom Cleveland, America's youngest First Lady, The Gambler's Daughter, and Charles Gates Dawes, A Life. She recently completed the biography of the First Lady Lou Henry Hoover and is in the process of identifying a publisher. Annette has appeared on C-SPAN First Ladies series to discuss Frances Cleveland and Lou Henry Hoover, and was a panelist at the Harding Symposium's Modern First Ladies program in 2015. Her program, First Ladies and the Politics of Fashion, was inspired by her research on Frances Folsom Cleveland and has been broadcast on C-SPAN. Annette holds a BA from the University of Arizona and an MBA from Washington University in St. Louis. She and her husband of 40 years live on a farm in North Carolina and raise cattle. They have 4 children and 6 grandchildren. I'm excited to welcome and turn things over to Annette, who will be speaking about her talk, From Private Citizen to Public Face, Frances Cleveland. So thank you, Annette, and we are excited to have you here with us today.
Well, good morning. I guess we're to afternoon now if you're in Eastern time, so good afternoon. And for those of you on Central or further west, good morning still. I'm delighted to be with you and have an opportunity to talk with you about Frances Cleveland. So I have been very much immersed in wrapping up details with the Lou Henry Hoover biography. So it was wonderful to revisit Frances and get reacquainted with her to get prepared for the program this afternoon, and my thanks to being asked to share this with you. So Allison made mention that there are several important anniversaries in the month of June, and one of those does happen to be the anniversary of Frances and Grover Cleveland, and today marks their 135th wedding anniversary. And so happy 135th, Grover and Frank. And she was indeed known as Frank. One of the interesting things about Frances Cleveland's first 100 days in the White House was a very public discussion about how the public should talk about the First Lady, what first name should be used for her. So we'll get into that a little bit as we move through the program. So as Allison has said, you do have the chat function, and I do hope that we'll have some questions for me to answer and give you more information than what I have outlined for us this afternoon through the PowerPoint presentation. So we're going to look at Frances's first 100 days in the White House. Frances Folsom Cleveland, at the time that she married Grover Cleveland, who was a sitting president, became the nation's youngest First Lady by a few years, beating out Julia Tyler, who was John Tyler's second wife. And Frances remains to this day the nation's youngest First Lady. She was roughly 6 weeks shy of her 21st birthday when she married Grover Cleveland in a White House ceremony. And at the time I was working on the Cleveland book, I had a daughter who was approaching 21 years of age. And I thought to myself, I am not sure that I would want to see my 21-year-old daughter take on the responsibilities and the public scrutiny of being the nation's First Lady. So there is much more behind this young woman than just what is very obviously quite a pretty face. So just a couple of biographical details of Frances Folsom Cleveland. She was born July 21st, 1864 in Buffalo, New York. Her father was Oscar Folsom. Her mother was Emma Harmon. Oscar Folsom became good friends and law partner for a short period of time with Grover Cleveland, which is how Grover Cleveland became introduced and integrated into the family. Cleveland actually gave the Folsoms the baby carriage as a baby shower gift, if you will, when Frances was born. Frances' father was killed in a very tragic accident when 2 days after her 11th birthday. Her father was driving a horse and carriage, and he was known to be somewhat fast with the way in which he managed his buggy. And unfortunately, he was coming up a hill, and even in those days, there were blind spots. Another vehicle or conveyance, which was a dray, a cart with a horse, a horse with a cart behind it used to haul and deliver goods, was kind of actually backing out of its spot. And Oscar Folsom was coming too fast to stop in time. His horse reared. It threw him out of the buggy, and the buggy wheel ran over him, and he died later that evening. Grover Cleveland, there's a lot of information out there which claims that Grover Cleveland became Frances's guardian. That is, which would have been a legal relationship. That never did occur, but he did stay in touch with Emma Harmon Folsom and Frances Folsom, and actually it was Grover who arranged for Frank to attend Wells College, a small school that had been opened 2 years before Frances entered it in the early 1880s. So with that being said, I guess the next question is, who was Grover Cleveland? And you can probably see right away that the 27-year age difference is pretty remarkable. This photograph, the photograph of Frances that we just saw, was probably taken somewhere around the time of the wedding. This photograph of Grover Cleveland is attributed to 1888, and there's some biographers who say that he was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 300 pounds when this photo was taken. He was born March 18th, 1837 in Caldwell, New Jersey. His father was a Presbyterian minister. His mother came from Maryland, and she actually owned an enslaved person at the time of her wedding. With her husband being a Presbyterian minister and with his pulpits being north of the Mason-Dixon line, she had to relinquish the enslaved person, and send that individual back to Baltimore, Maryland. Grover was not able to go to college due to the sudden death of his father, even though he had received a scholarship. So he read law in some local law offices, including an uncle's law office, and he became known as somebody who was extremely honest and very, very scrupulous about his financial dealings. And so he was elected sheriff of Erie County, New York, and then became mayor of Buffalo. He served as mayor of Buffalo for 1 year, and in 1882 he was elected as governor of New York State. So a little interesting aside about how do you court somebody who is, when you're the governor of New York and she's attending a small private all-girls school. And one of the interesting things about Wells College was that any male who was not a blood relation to one of the female students had to receive parental permission to be able to write to the young ladies. And so Grover Cleveland, as governor of New York, received permission from Emma Folsom to write to Frank. He routinely sent her flowers from the greenhouse that was part of the governor's mansion in Albany. And one of the things I didn't know at the time that I wrote the book, but that somebody told me when I visited Aurora a few years ago, was that Cleveland actually had a special private rail track installed between Albany and Aurora. in order to privately come to the campus and visit with and court the young Miss Folsom. In 1884, Cleveland was nominated as the Democratic candidate for president. He was obviously elected, and the inauguration at those times was in March. So he was inaugurated March 4th, 1885. So between the March 4th date and the June 2nd date, his sister served as his unmarried sister served as his first lady. And then when he married Frances in the ceremony in the White House on June 2nd, 1886, she obviously assumed those duties. So the White House there, the actual engagement was not officially announced until what we today would call Memorial Day weekend. At that time, it was known as Decoration Day. Frances and Grover Cleveland had an understanding about the time that she graduated from Wells in June of 1885. And then she, with her mother and a cousin, embarked on a European tour, which was fairly common for middle class and upper class young people at the time, especially those who had attended college. It was there that her grandfather, Folsom, had given her money to purchase a trousseau. And several of her garments, when we talk about fashion, several of her garments were actually made by the famous House of Worth, which essentially created and defined what French couturier fashion was for the time, for the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s. The public went wild when they found out that this very gruff and portly president was going to marry this sweet young thing. And the press could not get enough information about this mystery young woman who was about to become the wife of Grover Cleveland and First Lady of the nation. Frances did not arrive in the White House until the morning of June 2nd. She spent the day getting prepared. Her future sister-in-law helped with many of the wedding preparations. The wedding took place in the Blue Room, which had been decorated under Chester Arthur's administration by Louis Comfort Tiffany. And the two officials who performed the ceremony were a local Presbyterian minister, Byron Sutherland, and Grover Cleveland's brother, who was also a minister, William. In those days, you did not have fencing, protective fencing, razor wire, National Guard, Secret Service, or any type of real crowd control or public access control to the White House. It truly was the people's house, and people did come and go. And so I would try to find the sketch of the crowds that were gathered around the White House during the marriage ceremony, because it's just a great depiction of the windows being wide open, the lights, or in this case, the candles in the candelabra being greatly lit in the area, and people scrambling to get a glimpse or to hear a word exchanged. There was very, very little privacy to this ceremony on the exterior of the White House, and the interior was relatively a small private wedding. The Clevelands hoped very much to keep their honeymoon destination, which was Deer Park, Maryland. It was owned by a good friend of Grover Cleveland's. It was hoped that they would have privacy, but a telegraph operator let the secret out. And so reporters got hold of trains and managed to actually beat the Clevelands to Deer Park and awaited them and more or less hounded them throughout the entirety of their honeymoon. George Cleveland, Grover Cleveland's grandson, who does an imitation of his grandfather, also tells the story of how the reporters literally climbed and hung from trees, intercepted servants who were bringing meals to the cottage where the newlyweds were staying, and lifted lids to find out what the Clevelands were eating. So it was a very invasive and intrusive time together and not much of it gives a whole new meaning to the term honeymoon period, and probably not the best meaning at all. So this is a sketch that appeared in Harpers Weekly of the marriage ceremony. You can see Grover Cleveland being portrayed perhaps as maybe even a little bit younger, but certainly the contrast between the youth and the size of the couple. And yet you can see just smiles and well wishes on the faces of the people who are observing the nuptials take place. And then, just to demonstrate how extremely popular this event was, another weekly newspaper, which is Franklies Illustrated, and I should say, if you're not too familiar with the Frank Leslie Illustrated papers, depending on how much history you're engaged with, Frank Leslie was actually run by his widow. And so she certainly understood her readership. And this is a sketch of Frances's mother giving her a kiss and Grover receiving some congratulations from someone. Emma Folsom at that point was still a widow, although she remarried a year or two after Frances and Grover got married. In fact, there's a very interesting, Grover Cleveland is not well known for having what was truly a very delicious and rich sense of humor. He hid it by, he hid it under this gruff facade of just being very short-tempered and abrupt. But there's a delicious letter that is quoted by a couple of his biographers where he says that Frank has gone off to attend her mother's wedding. He then mentioned that she had married Mr. Perrine, and he said the young folks just jumped up and decided that they couldn't wait and went ahead and got married. And the young folks, of course, being Emma Folsom and her older gentleman friend who became her second husband. So it's just just that alone is some good insight to this other side of Grover Cleveland, which, because of the public persona that he projected, really, really, really made the public just unbelievably curious about why this very beautiful and attractive and seemingly very intelligent woman would want to marry this stodgy, seemingly uncultured, if you will, boor almost. And yet there were some very interesting behind the scenes aspects of Grover Cleveland that Frank brought out and became more public, but were certainly not known to the public at the time of the wedding. So Frances did not wait very long to take on her hostess duties as the new mistress of the White House, if you will. This comes from the Washington Evening Star. That was from June 25th, 1886. So you can see that she hadn't even been married a full month yet. And it talks about how Mrs. Cleveland received callers at home and what she wore, and then who helped her with the reception. It was typical. This is actually this story is published on a Friday, and it talks about the reception being held on a Thursday. Wednesdays were usually the typical day for women to come and through the White House and shake hands with the First Lady, for the First Lady to make the doors open and make herself available to anybody who wanted to come into the White House and greet her. What is interesting about Frances Cleveland in the first Cleveland administration, so the Clevelands are the only couple, or I should probably say, Grover Cleveland is the only person to serve 2 non-consecutive terms as president. And there were some very notable changes with how Frances served as First Lady in the second administration, mainly because she had already started to have children and continued to have children throughout her tenure in those 4 years in the White House. But in the time that she was in the White House during the first Cleveland administration, she was very sensitive to the needs of working with young women. And so in addition to having her typical midweek reception, she also held one on Saturdays. And Cleveland's, what today we would call his chief of staff, Daniel Lamont, would complain about her holding 2 receptions a week to which she replied that she felt that she had an obligation to make herself accessible to women who had to work for a living. So it was a very interesting outlook on things from a young lady who, even though her father had left them nearly destitute. Oscar Folsom had not been very good with his money. Family stepped in to make sure that all of the needs were met. And so Frances, even though she had never been forced to go out and work and also was privileged to have a college education, which is very, very unusual at her time. And depending on who you talk to, some will say that she is the first lady to have gotten a 4-year degree, and there are others who will say that Lucy Hayes is the first one because she graduated from, I believe it was Wesleyan Female Seminary right there in Ohio. So, but she very quickly became the hostess, and there is either an urban legend or an actual for real exchange between Grover and Frances's mother, Emma, who was still there in the White House after they came back from the honeymoon. And they kind of peeked around the door to see how Frances was acquitting herself with all of these strange women. And they were very, very impressed. And Cleveland exclaimed, "She'll do, she'll do," very happy about how she was handling her new duties and responsibilities. As Allison mentioned, you're going to be hearing about a more recent fashion designer, but Frances Folsom Cleveland was considered at the so the interesting thing about Allison talking about a designer who designed Jacqueline Kennedy's wedding gown is that those of us who are old enough to remember Jacqueline Kennedy will understand this analogy, and Frances Cleveland was indeed the Jacqueline Kennedy of her day. She had that high level of popularity, and she was a tremendous, tremendous fashion icon. One of the things that got people's attention was her willingness to wear low-cut bodices and sleeveless gowns, such as the one depicted in this photograph. So an interesting story about that is Frances's roommate at Wells College, Catherine Willard, was the niece of the woman who founded the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And if I'm not a little too nervous from being on the camera here, I believe her first name was Emma. And somebody may want to correct me if I've got that wrong. So I will just say Ms. Willard, so I'm not giving too much misinformation out. But Ms. Willard's responsibilities, of course, with the Women's Christian Temperance Union was not only to try to get bars and saloons closed, to get people to take the pledge not to drink. And by the way, Frances had taken a pledge as a teenager not to drink alcohol. And but she also promoted what were perceived as the Christian virtues, including feminine modesty. And feminine modesty did not include sleeveless and low bodice gowns. And so she wrote a letter to Mrs. Cleveland explaining to her that she was not setting a good image for America's young women by dressing the way that she was in sleeveless and low bodice gowns. And you can see, and if you'll remember the photograph that was used to promote this talk, which is the official portrait of Frances Cleveland, who was wearing sleeveless and a low-cut gown, and that portrait was done in 1899. You can see that Frances decided not to pay too much attention. It's Frances Willard. Okay, got it right this time. We're not too interested in listening to what Frances Willard had to say. The other part of Frances becoming a fashion icon overnight was that women absolutely adored her hairstyle, which was actually clipped slightly in the back of the head. And so there were discussions in the women's magazines and in the society pages about how women were flocking to hairdressers and asking to have their hair styled a la Cleveland. But perhaps one of the other areas where Frances began to make her mark in the first 100 days as the nation's new and youngest First Lady was in the area of the theater. She and Grover Cleveland attended the theater in early July for the first of what would become many times, not just during the first Cleveland administration, but throughout the second Cleveland administration. And here is really where we begin to see some things about Grover Cleveland the public didn't know and didn't understand. The National Theater was opened up and refurbished in the early 1880s. And there were comments made by its manager that the new president, that would have been Grover Cleveland, had not once come to the theater since he had come into office. And then all of a sudden he gets married and he starts to become a regular attendee at the theater. So some of the marriage brought out this other side of Grover Cleveland. As I mentioned earlier, not only did he have a delicious sense of humor, he was also a fantastic mimic and an outstanding raconteur. And he was very much a man's man. He liked to hunt. He absolutely loved fishing. And he also had a tendency to probably drink a little bit too much, particularly when he was in the company of other men and he was out on one of his fishing or hunting trips. Not this first year of their being in the White House in this, so not in the first 100 days, but in the second summer, Frances, being the nation's first lady and having influence, had been elected to the Board of Trustees for Wells College. And she went to attend a trustees meeting and attend the graduation of Wells girls in June of 1887. And it was there that she met another trustee by the name of Richard Watson Gilder. Gilder and his artist wife, Helena Decay Gilder, were very influential in New York art circles. Gilder, the male, was the editor of Scribner's Magazine, which was a very popular and successful literary magazine in the latter half of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. The Gilders had a place at Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts, and that is where the Clevelands decided to purchase a summer home. That location and the salon that the Gilders ran in their home exposed the Clevelands to a wide variety of artists, including the famed actor Joseph Jefferson, who had made his living portraying the Washington Irving's character Rip Van Winkle. And so the Jeffersons became good friends with the Clevelands. Joseph Jefferson became very good friends with Grover Cleveland. And it's here where this strong interest in the arts and in promoting artistic accomplishment really starts to come out. And that is actually, in many ways, not only just the proximity to these people in their summer residence, but these were the areas where Frank was very interested. I was kind of doing a quick update read on Grover to double check some facts, and the person who wrote Cleveland's biography for the Miller Presidential Center pointed out that Cleveland was not considered to be particularly intellectual or wide-read. And yet what's absolutely curious is when you read excerpts of some of his letters that are published in the biography that Nevins wrote of Cleveland, he talks about some popular literary books that have been published and that he is looking forward to reading it, but he'll say Frank was reading it first, or I'm reading this book that Frank read first. So again, her influence on him and some of the hidden aspects of his personality really stayed that way to the general public, and even to some extent to people that have biographied Cleveland. So, what really happened not only in the first 100 days, but in the remainder of the first Cleveland administration, and then in the second Cleveland administration, 1889 to 1893. And just a quick reminder, the country slid into a very, very serious depression towards the end of that second Cleveland administration. So it was a very different time period and a very different atmosphere by the time the Clevelands left the second time. But with Frances's influence, these are some of the things that she helped to achieve, some of what she did, and some of what she got her husband to support with Congress. So I've already talked about her very strong support of all of the arts, particularly the theater arts, but she also was a great lover of literature and of poetry, and with her work with Helena Decay Gilder, who was a visual artist, the visual arts as well. I should also mention that the Clevelands became very, very good friends with the author Samuel Clemens. One of the things that we probably don't think too much about today, but copyright laws were not standardized across the world. And so American authors often have their works pirated just even in European nations. So one of the things that Frances worked to do, again, remembering women did not have the right to vote. So what they had to do was convince men of the importance of a particular cause. But she worked behind the scenes and even attended the hearings and the vote at the Capitol to revise copyright laws to help protect American authors' works abroad. And some of this came out of the very close friendships with the Gilders and with Samuel Clemens and others in that authors community. Frances Cleveland was an incredibly avid knitter. In fact, after she left the White House and she was active in an organization called the Knitting Guild. She was its president for many years, including during several of the years of the Great Depression. But as First Lady, she would annually knit layette sets, and she donated them to the Negro Home for Destitute Women and Children that was located in Washington, D.C. She also was someone who was extremely committed to education of all kinds, strongly supported the education of young girls and women. She stayed a trustee for Wells College nearly to her death. And as the First Lady, she helped to support the development of kindergartens, not just as a type of daycare for women who had to work, but as a way for development of children of all ages. And if you're old enough to remember about Jacqueline Kennedy having a kindergarten for Caroline in the White House, Frances actually had established a kindergarten for her oldest daughter, Ruth. I'm struggling to remember if that was in the White House as well, but I'd almost be willing to say, yes, I'm correct on that. And then I've kind of already shared some of her demonstrated independence in her fashion choices by wearing those things that she knew she was attractive in, and she obviously was a very good-looking and attractive woman. She had a tremendous sense of style. One of the interesting things when I had an opportunity to go through the Grover Cleveland papers and to find copies of receipts of hers for the dressmakers, which incidentally, she maintained all of the family financial records. That's not something that you would particularly think that she would be doing, given Grover's experience working with the railroads and also what an astute financial manager he was. But she handled all of the household accounts, and she was actually very, very frugal. You see invoices from some of her dressmakers about having clothing altered or remade. In fact, the beautiful wedding dress that she wore, which if I can back up to that. So this wedding dress, which along the dress folds over, those are actually orange blossoms, which were considered a sign of good luck, that have been attached to the seam lines of the overskirt and up around the bodice, and then again on the. She had that dress. She had the orange blossoms removed and some of the dress slightly restyled so that she could continue to wear it at receptions in the White House. So this was a woman who, even though she dressed beautifully and had an enormous sense of style, also was very careful with her money and would have her clothes today what we would call repurposed. So with that, Allison, I think I'm going to turn this over to you and see what we've got in the way of questions.
Sure, we had quite a few questions here. I wondered, Just thinking about Frances Cleveland and her involvement in the arts and your discussion of copyright, her image was used so much in advertising when she was in the role of First Ladies to sell products. I wondered what her feeling was on that and if she ever tried um, to take control or go after people who were misusing her image.
Thank you for bringing that up. I actually tried to find some copies of those ads so that I could have used them to explain that. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. So for those of you who may not know, Frances's image was used to market all kinds of products, including different kinds of elixirs that were going to promise cures for everything, kidney helping medicine, and most of the things that we now know are just marketed without any um, proof of efficacy, if you will. And she, with Grover's support and help, attempted to get legislation through Congress that would prohibit the use of the image of any well known person without getting their permission. And I don't know if it was because people were, enough members of Congress were beginning to be unhappy with Grover Cleveland, or if because she was a woman, they didn't think something like that was important, because it was kind of known that what was happening with her was the catalyst for requesting this legislation, but it could not get passed. So her image continued to be used, and it was very frustrating and to a certain extent really demeaning of her and her role.
There's a really interesting question here asking if Frances ever indicated what attracted her to Cleveland, considering the age difference and everything.
No, there is really no discussion of what that appeal was. I sometimes think that because she was very much attracted to a seminary student, a Presbyterian seminary student. And from what I'm able to determine from the research that I did, it appears to me as if she was actually discouraged from having that relationship and broke off. It's my understanding there was an actual engagement, and breaking that engagement off. In fact, she had to kind of try to make amends with this young man's mother, and the young man's mother wasn't easily swayed just because Frances was now the first lady of the nation. But I think that perhaps some of the attraction had to do with the financial security that she was going to get after what was a fairly turbulent teenage years. Um, she actually quit high school. She never officially graduated high school. She was having some emotional and psychological problems, and the arrangement to get her into Wells College, which Grover Cleveland, as I said, facilitated, was really a way to help kind of, if you will, get her sort of back on track. And it worked.
Another question here is asking about the time in between the two presidencies. What was the couple doing during that time? Where did they live? What did they occupy their lives with?
Right. So they moved to New York City, and Cleveland worked in with law, and he probably did law work for some of the railroads. He had connections in the railroad industry, and he there really was no well, two things. First of all, let me just say this. Cleveland's defeat in the 1888 election was another one of those cases where he won the popular vote, but he lost the electoral vote. We think today of Florida as kind of being a key state with regard to whoever carries that state may or may not end up determining who becomes president of the United States. Well, at that time period, New York State sort of fulfilled that role. So even though Cleveland had been governor of New York State, in 1888, the state went for Benjamin Harrison, not for Grover Cleveland. So even though nationwide Cleveland had won the popular vote, he didn't win the electoral vote because he didn't win New York State's electoral votes. So he was still very popular among the Democrats. Nobody else had really risen to the top in a way that appealed to the Democratic politicos who made decisions in those times. So he was renominated for I said 88. Let me back up. Yeah, the 86 elect. No, I was right. Okay. I'm sorry. He got back um, in the early 90s, 92 to 96. Okay, so I'm off by 4 years. Anyway, yeah, he lost the 88 election. Nobody really came to the top, so he got reelected in 1893. But part of that reelection also had to do with the fact that the country had entered into an extremely severe depression, and there were all kinds of arguments about whether or not to have what was called bimetallism, which was to have the coinage of silver and to have it be of, so many ounces of silver would equal so many ounces of gold, and to have a two metal system instead of just a gold standard. So there were several other economic things going on at the time.
We have several questions asking about the Baby Ruth candy bar and its significance to Frances.
Sure. I've never really gotten to the bottom of that. I've heard a lot of different conflicting information. So Ruth Cleveland was the Cleveland's first child. She was born in 1891. So back to the question, what happened in those intervening 4 years? They lived in New York City. Their first child was born. And then Ruth tragically died in January 1904 of diphtheria. The Baby Ruth candy bar did not come about until, I want to say, 1908 or 1909. And some people have said it has to do with the baseball player Babe Ruth, but I don't think that he had particularly become all that popular by that point. Some were saying, yes, it is a reminder of Baby Ruth, which was kind of the way the public thought of the Cleveland's child. But the other thing to think about is that Cleveland died in June of 1908. So it's kind of hard, at least for me, and other people may see it differently and disagree. That's the nice thing about history. You can interpret it in different ways. I am really not 100% convinced that the name of that candy bar was tied back to the Cleveland's child, although there are some who make a fairly strong case that it actually is.
There are so many questions here. People are very curious and want to know a lot of things. So I'm moving through these the best that I can. What was there any negative press at the time around the marriage? People are kind of chatting about, I know, the stigma of the age difference at the time. Was that an issue? How did the press handle that, or was that pretty common?
I think there was some commonality on age differences, probably more in after the Civil War, because there had been so many young men who had been killed, and at that time, pretty much if you were a woman and didn't have a man to help provide for you economically, you were fairly limited in what you could do to earn a living legitimately. So there were a lot of what we would today call May September or even May December type marriages. More of the negative press had come about Cleveland had come out during the campaign because of the scandal of that he may have fathered an illegitimate child out of wedlock. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that, yes, he is the father and tried to cover this up. There's also some fairly good evidence that it may actually have been Oscar Folsom who fathered the child, and Cleveland covered up on behalf of his friend because his friend was married and had a child of his own. So that seems to be more where the negativity came out. But people, by and large, were just absolutely thrilled with who Frances was and thought she was positively delightful. About the only kind of strongly negative press was this one comment from one of Cleveland's political enemies who says, "I hate Grover Cleveland so much I don't even think his wife is beautiful." That's about, it's about as nasty as people seem to get. That kind of changed in the second Cleveland administration for several different reasons, but in those first years, it was very, very popular.
There's a question you kind of spoke to, possible entanglements for the president prior to Frances, but did Grover have any earlier engagements or serious relationships before Frances?
There does not seem to be as if there was, other than whether or not he did have did have an ongoing relationship with Maria Halpin, who is the woman who was the mother of the child who eventually was adopted by a couple in Buffalo, New York. And that child, by the way, became a professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Buffalo Medical School. And I used to know his name, but it's been several years since I've read it.
Can you speak a little bit before Frances was in the White House? Who played the role of the First Lady or hostess, and
It
what
was
was
his unmarried sister, and I don't know why in the world. I think Michelle Gullion is on. Maybe she can shoot us a chat. Um, I cannot. I don't know why I'm drawing a blank on his sister's first name, and I'm sorry for that. But
It's
it was his
Rose.
unmarried sister who he had actually paid. Grover had paid for her college education.
Is it Rose?
Rose, thank you. Yes.
Let's see. There's a lot of questions about Frances's post White House life and second marriage. If you could speak a little bit about that.
Sure. So Frances was the first presidential widow to remarry, and that kind of got some people's eyebrows up and wagging because you weren't supposed to do that if you'd been married to a sitting president. But I think, as we've already seen, she was an independent-minded woman, and she was going to do the things that she wanted. Thomas Preston Jr., who was her second husband, was originally from New Jersey. She had known, well, let me back up a second. The Clevelands moved to Princeton, New Jersey after they got out of the White House a second time. Cleveland worked as an advisor for the Equitable Assurance Company, and the Clevelands were good friends with the Woodrow Wilsons because Wilson was a professor at Princeton and ultimately became its president, as well as several other notable historians, a couple of whom wrote biographies of Cleveland with Frances's encouragement. Preston had been an adult student at Princeton. He graduated at the age of 50. And there is some suggestion that Frances, as a trustee of Wells, and this would have been after Grover's passing, became romantically interested in Preston and arranged for him to get a professor of art at Wells College. And there is a joke that she put him up there where she could keep her eye on him. So the courtship, such as it was kept fairly quiet. There is an interesting little piece in the Aurora newspaper, which may or may not be fully true, where Preston went to see the president of Wells, and because he had been living in an apartment on campus. He was living on top of a store near campus, and Preston said to the president, "I need some help finding a place to live. I'm about to be married." And the president said, "Well, what's wrong with your accommodations above so-and-so store?" And so Preston allegedly said, I am marrying Mrs. Grover Cleveland, and it won't do to move with her into the top above so-and-so store." So that's kind of how the cat got out of the bag from his side of things. The couple more or less eloped. The marriage was just in some ways, as you saw, Cleveland kind of blossom under in his marriage to Frank and some of the aspects of his personality that weren't well known. Frances seems to really blossom under with her marriage to Preston. Cleveland was this strong believer in what was called spheres of influence, that women shouldn't have the right to vote, that they should stay out of the dirty world of politics. Frances stayed with that view until the day women got the right to vote. She actually had become vice president of the New Jersey Association for Anti-Suffrage. And yes, there were associations for anti-suffrage. But she got active in, politically active in raising funds and building patriotism for America's entry in World War One. She continued to be very active in other public causes. So, in addition to being active with the Knitters Guild, so I think by and large, the marriage was one that was very satisfying for her.
Thank you for answering that question. I think I have one or two more here. Was Frances married to Grover Cleveland when he had a secret operation to remove his cancerous jaw? And if so, how did she handle that?
She was she was as much involved with it, with the planning, with the concealing, as he was. She was fully and totally into it. She knew exactly what was going on.
I think the last question we had here is about kind of Frances's reception related to later first ladies. Did she revisit the White House after she served as first lady? She's definitely kind of a model in some ways for the more modern first ladies as far as becoming a pop culture icon, being embraced. What was the reception and reaction as far as later first ladies to Frances Cleveland?
To be really honest with you, I think she just sort of, because Grover Cleveland was older and had lost much of his popularity. So I think it's helpful for those who may not keep track of these things. Cleveland was the first Democrat to be elected to the White House since James Buchanan. So then you had a Republican in the interregnum of the two non-consecutive Cleveland years, and then you get right back to Republicans again, and you don't have another Democrat until Woodrow Wilson. And so Cleveland really just sort of becomes this placeholder in the White House for two non-consecutive terms. And other historians may disagree with me because, I mean, there were things that got accomplished during that time, but when I say placeholder, it's in the sense that the Democrats really didn't have the strongest national presence. So he served his terms. He, enacted those things which he helped to either enact or vetoed those things which he vetoed. But he was not he did not continue to be a national player, and in a lot of ways, because of Frances's own belief, kind of being boxed in by his views of what a woman's place was, also having a house full of young children, having lost a child. She had given birth to her fifth child in July of 1903, and then she loses her husband in 08. She was busy, so there wasn't a lot there. But there is a very interesting story, however, about a reception that Frances attended in, I believe, either 1946 or shortly before her death in 1947. And she is at a table with Margaret Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. And Frances is talking to Margaret Truman and asking what Margaret thinks of the White House and discussing the changes that were in the White House. And Dwight Eisenhower overhears snippets of this conversation. And so he says, and bear in mind, she's known to this whole table as Mrs. Preston. And so Eisenhower's listening to this conversation, and he picks up on this Mrs. Preston has lived in Washington. And so he says, well, Mrs. Preston, where did you live when you were in Washington? To which Frances says to him, the same place where Margaret is living now. And, I just kind of look sort of weird at it. What do you mean you were living where Margaret lives now? Because, of course, Trumans were in the White House. And so Margaret Truman laughs and says, General Eisenhower, you are speaking to the former Mrs. Grover Cleveland.
What a great story. Well, Annette, thank you so much for sharing this time and expanding my knowledge of Frances Cleveland beyond drunk history. I really appreciate that. So if we are looking for more information on your latest projects or past books, where can we reach out? And when do you think we'll be able to access this Lou Hoover book on the horizon?
Right. So the Frances Cleveland book is published by State University of New York Press. The Gambler's Daughter is also published by that press. They are available through Amazon or through the publisher. The Charles Gates Dawes book, I think, is available on Amazon or through its publisher, Northwestern University Press. The publisher I've secured for the Lou Henry Hoover book is University of Nebraska Press, and we are in the last revisions, which are due to them at the end of June. So it's usually a 12 to 18 month time period. So I would say probably winter, January of 23 or thereabouts would be a reasonable expectation on
Great.
the Lou Hoover book.
Well, we're excited to have you back, maybe even in person at the
That'd
National.
be great. Yeah, things should be opened up by then.
Yeah. So thank you, Annette, so much for joining us today. Thank you, everyone, for attending. This has been a great conversation in the chat. Lots of questions, lots of info and back and forth. So it was definitely a fruitful discussion, and we encourage you to head to the National First Ladies Library on social media or Eventbrite to register for future events and join us for next month's Legacy Lecture. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.